when the most powerful ruler in the Americas and the commander of a small foreign army stood face to face for the first time. Neither of them had a word in their own language for what the other was. What happened in that moment and in the months that followed has been argued over for 5 centuries, and the argument has not settled, because it touches something that history rarely makes visible so directly: limits of what any framework of understanding can contain. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
There is an emperor whose name has been used for 5 centuries as a symbol of failure, of passivity, of a civilization that did not know how to respond to its own destruction, and who deserves to be examined in full, rather than through the legends built over his memory. Tonight, we turn to the final years of one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, and to the man who stood at the center of its most consequential moment. The question before us is whether Moctezuma II was a man who failed to respond to a crisis, or a man who responded to an unprecedented situation with the only tools his world had given him.
The answer requires us to begin not with the arrival of the Spanish, but with the civilization that Moctezuma governed, because the encounter cannot be understood without first understanding what the Mexica world was, how it works.
We are speaking about Moctezuma II.
Moctezuma II was the 9th Tlatoani, or ruler, of the Mexica people, who governed the most powerful political entity in Mesoamerica, from 1502 until his death in 1520, a period that culminated in the most dramatic and consequential encounter between 2 civilizations in the history of the Americas.
Then let us begin with the empire he governed, and with the city at its center.
Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, was built on an island in the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico. When Spanish observers first saw it in 1519, they estimated its population at somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth at that time. The city was connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, and was supplied with fresh water through an aqueduct system. It contained markets, temples, palaces, schools, and administrative buildings, arranged around a monumental ceremonial center. The empire that Tenochtitlan administered was not a uniform territorial state of the kind that European observers were accustomed to. It was a network of tribute relationships, through which hundreds of city-states and communities paid regular contributions of goods, labor, and military service to the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan.
So the empire was organized around tribute and obligation, rather than around uniform administrative control.
Yes, and understanding this is essential to understanding the political dynamics that the Spanish would exploit. Many of the communities within the empire were not loyal subjects of Tenochtitlan, but tributary states that had been conquered and resented their subordinate position. The Tlaxcalans, who would become the most important indigenous military allies of the Spanish, were not part of the Aztec tribute system at all. They had maintained their independence through decades of conflict with Tenochtitlan, and had every reason to welcome an alliance with anyone capable of challenging Mexica power. Moctezuma had come to power through election by a council of nobles in 1502. He was already an experienced military commander, and a man of considerable religious authority. His title, Tlatoani, meant speaker, but his role was far more than administrative. The ruler of Tenochtitlan was understood to be the earthly representative of the sun, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order through the performance of ceremonies, the management of the ritual calendar, and the provision of human sacrifice that the gods were believed to require.
So governance and cosmology were inseparable in the Mexica world.
Yes, and this matters enormously for understanding how Moctezuma received and interpreted the arrival of the Spanish. His decisions were not made by a secular political strategist calculating advantage. They were made by a man who understood his role in cosmic, as well as political terms. Here we must address one of the most persistent myths surrounding Moctezuma and his response to the Spanish. The most famous version holds that Moctezuma believed Cortés to be the god Quetzalcoatl, returning from the east as Aztec prophecy had supposedly foretold, and that this belief paralyzed him and prevented any effective military response. Contemporary scholars have examined this explanation carefully, and found it largely unconvincing. The detailed accounts linking Cortés specifically to Quetzalcoatl appear primarily in documents written decades after the conquest, often by Spanish writers or by indigenous writers working under Spanish patronage. The earlier and more immediate indigenous accounts do not describe Moctezuma as paralyzed by religious awe. They describe a sophisticated ruler employing the diplomatic and intelligence-gathering methods available to him under conditions of genuine uncertainty.
So the story that has shaped popular understanding of Moctezuma for centuries may be more a product of conquest narratives than of what actually happened.
Exactly. The Quetzalcoatl narrative served Spanish interests by explaining the conquest as divinely ordained and as something the Aztecs themselves had anticipated and accepted. It is a story that makes conquest look inevitable rather than contingent, and it tells us more about the purposes of its authors than about the mind of Moctezuma. What we can say with more confidence is that Moctezuma responded to the arrival of the Spanish with a strategy of observation and diplomatic engagement. When reports first reached him of unfamiliar vessels along the coast in 1519, he sent emissaries carrying gifts and instructions to learn everything possible about these strangers. The gifts he sent were not a sign of submission. They were, within the diplomatic conventions of Mesoamerican politics, a probe in the exchange culture of the region. Giving extraordinary gifts to powerful visitors was a way of establishing relationship, demonstrating one's own wealth and authority, and opening a channel for communication.
So Moctezuma was reading the situation through his own diplomatic framework, and the Spanish were receiving those signals through a completely different one.
Yes, and that mutual misreading was not a failure of intelligence on either side. It was the structural problem of an encounter between two worlds that had developed entirely separately, and had no shared vocabulary for what they were doing to one another. Cortés moved inland from the coast, gathering allies among the Tlaxcalans and other peoples who had grievances against Tenochtitlan. By the time he reached the city in November of 1519, he commanded not only a few hundred Spanish soldiers, but thousands of indigenous warriors. The meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés at the entrance to the city is one of the most discussed moments in the history of the Americas. Moctezuma descended from his litter to greet Cortés on foot. He offered words of welcome and formal hospitality. The Spanish accounts record phrases often translated as "you are welcome" or "this is your house," words that have sometimes been read as submission, and sometimes as ceremonial language of the kind that elite encounters in Mesoamerica required.
So even the words of that first greeting have been contested across centuries of interpretation.
Yes, and the contest is not merely academic. How you read those words determines how you understand everything that followed. If the greeting was submission, then what came next was its logical consequence. If it was diplomatic protocol, then what came next was a betrayal of an offered hospitality. Within days of entering the city, Cortés made a decision that transformed the encounter entirely. Using a pretext related to an attack on Spanish soldiers along the coast, he took Moctezuma into custody inside the palace, holding him as a hostage under the protection of Spanish arms. The psychological and political consequences of this act were severe. Moctezuma continued to function formally as emperor, issuing instructions and receiving visitors, but he was doing so under coercion. The authority of the Tlatoani rested on a form of sacred prestige that captivity fundamentally damaged.
So Cortés had removed the foundations of Moctezuma's power by removing him from the ceremonial and political context in which that power had meaning.
Yes, and among the Mexica leadership this produced a crisis of legitimacy. Some nobles and commanders concluded that a ruler held captive by foreigners could no longer be trusted to speak for Mexica interests. Tensions in the city rose through the following months. When Cortés left Tenochtitlan to deal with a rival Spanish force on the coast, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado ordered a massacre of Mexican nobles during a religious festival at the Templo Mayor. The precise circumstances remain disputed, but the consequences were immediate. The Mexica population rose in open revolt. Cortés returned to a city in armed conflict. The Spanish forces and their allies were besieged inside the palace complex. In this crisis, Moctezuma was apparently asked or compelled to address the population from the palace walls. What happened next is one of the most disputed moments in the entire account. Moctezuma died in late June of 1520. The Spanish accounts claim he was struck by stones thrown by his own people and died of his wounds. Indigenous accounts suggest he was killed by the Spanish when he was no longer useful.
So even his death is contested, with each side producing an account that serves its own interpretation of who was responsible.
Yes, and the uncertainty around his death mirrors the uncertainty around almost every significant moment in his encounter with the Spanish, because the documentary record was produced overwhelmingly by people who had strong interests in how the story was told. In the chaos of the night, the Spanish fled Tenochtitlan. They lost a significant portion of their soldiers, horses, artillery, and the gold they had accumulated. It was a catastrophic military reversal by any measure. That the Spanish regrouped at all, rather than retreating to the coast, was a testament to Cortés' particular combination of determination and strategic calculation, and to the continued support of the Tlaxcalan alliance, which had every reason to remain committed to the destruction of Mexican power. The Spanish forces, having regrouped and secured additional allies, returned to lay siege to the city. After months of fighting and siege, Tenochtitlan fell in August of 1521. The city was largely destroyed in the process. The new Emperor Cuauhtémoc, who had led the defense, was captured and eventually executed. The Aztec Empire as it had existed was over.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to engage seriously with Moctezuma and the history of this encounter, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Moctezuma by Camilla Townsend.
So this is a work that draws on indigenous sources as well as Spanish chronicles, rather than relying only on the conquest narrative.
Precisely. Townsend uses both Spanish and indigenous documentary sources to reconstruct the political world in which Moctezuma ruled and the complex decisions he faced when Spanish forces arrived. She places him within the cultural and diplomatic traditions of the Mexica, rather than reading his actions through the lens of the conquerors. The result is a portrait of Moctezuma as a ruler operating within a sophisticated political system during a genuinely unprecedented crisis, rather than as a passive figure overwhelmed by events he could not comprehend.
Is it accessible to a reader without a background in Mesoamerican history?
It is written with clarity and care for readers who are new to the subject. Townsend provides sufficient context for the Mexico world and the nature of the encounter that the narrative is fully comprehensible without prior knowledge. She writes as a historian, but with the attention of a biographer. For a reader who wants to understand how one of the most dramatic turning points in world history looked from the perspective of those who were not the victors, this is an essential place to begin.
So reading it gives a reader both the history and the discipline of reading that history from multiple directions.
Yes, and that discipline is not merely academic. It is the only way to come close to what actually happened.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Moctezuma II is inseparable from the legacy of the conquest itself, which makes it one of the most contested historical reputations in the Americas. In the centuries following the conquest, Spanish colonial writers and their successors often portrayed Moctezuma as the embodiment of a civilization that lacked the spiritual and political vitality to survive contact with European Christendom. This interpretation served obvious ideological purposes. It made the destruction of the Aztec Empire appear as a natural outcome of the meeting between a higher and a lower civilization, rather than as the result of military force, epidemic disease, strategic alliance building, and the exploitation of existing political fractures.
So the interpretation of Moctezuma as weak or passive was itself a political act, produced in the service of justifying what had already been done.
Yes, and the task of later historians has been to work backward through those layers of interpretation to find something closer to what was actually happening in Tenochtitlan during those months. What emerges from the most careful recent scholarship is Moctezuma, who was neither a passive victim nor a figure of superhuman perception, but a highly capable ruler confronting a genuinely unprecedented situation with all the tools his civilization had developed over centuries. His strategy of diplomacy, gift exchange, and careful observation was not naivety. It was the standard method by which Mesoamerican powers managed encounters with unknown forces at their borders. What made this encounter different was not that Moctezuma applied the wrong tools, but that the situation was unlike anything those tools had been designed to handle.
So, the failure, if it can be called that, was not a personal failure. It was the failure of a framework that had never encountered what it was now being asked to process.
Yes, and this point is worth extending. The Spanish conquest of Mexico was not the triumph of a superior civilization over an inferior one. It was the result of a specific combination of factors: military technology, particularly horses and steel weapons, that the Mexica had never encountered; epidemic disease, particularly smallpox, that killed a significant portion of the population before the siege of Tenochtitlan even began; and the strategic brilliance of Cortés in constructing an indigenous coalition that made the Spanish force far larger than it appeared. Without the Tlaxcalan alliance and the catastrophic impact of epidemic disease, the Spanish force of a few hundred soldiers could not have defeated an empire of millions.
So the conquest was contingent, not inevitable. It required specific circumstances that could have been otherwise.
Yes, and that contingency matters because the alternative, the narrative of inevitability, has been used for centuries to justify not only the conquest of Mexico, but the broader history of European colonialism in the Americas. The city of Tenochtitlan, which had taken generations to build on its lake island, and which represented one of the great achievements of urban planning and social organization in the pre-modern world, was dismantled in the years following the conquest. Mexico City was built over its ruins, and Lake Texcoco was gradually drained over the following centuries. The civilization that Moctezuma had governed did not disappear entirely. Its language, Nahuatl, survived. Its agricultural systems, its artistic traditions, and many of its social practices persisted, and were absorbed into the colonial and post-colonial culture of Mexico.
Though the civilization was transformed but not erased, it continued in altered form in the world built over its physical ruins.
Yes, and Moctezuma's place in Mexican national memory has itself shifted over time. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, figures like Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor who died resisting the conquest, were elevated as national heroes, while Moctezuma was treated with ambivalence. More recent historical thinking has been kinder to him, recognizing that the judgment of his decisions depends heavily on which sources you read, which frameworks you use to interpret them, and which questions you are asking of the evidence. The broader historical significance of the encounter between Moctezuma and Cortés extends far beyond the fate of any individual or empire. It marks the beginning of a process of cultural, biological, and political transformation that reshaped the entire Western Hemisphere over the following centuries. The epidemic diseases that arrived with the Europeans killed tens of millions of people across the Americas in the century following first contact. The political and economic systems of indigenous civilizations were dismantled and replaced with colonial structures. Languages, religious practices, and forms of knowledge were suppressed or destroyed.
So what happened in Tenochtitlan in 1519 and 1520 was not only a military and political event, it was the opening of a catastrophe whose dimensions extended far beyond the city walls.
Yes, and understanding that scale requires recovering as fully as possible the world that was lost, and the man who stood at its center in its final years. Moctezuma greeted the Spanish with the formal language of hospitality. Whether that hospitality was naive, strategic, coerced, or something that requires a different word entirely, is a question that the historical record cannot fully resolve. What it can tell us is that he was not a passive figure but an active one, navigating an encounter that no one in his world had any precedent for, using the tools of a civilization that had governed millions of people across a vast and complex landscape for generations.
So the words "you are welcome" carry a weight that the person who spoke them could not have fully anticipated.
Yes, they were an offer made in good faith, within a tradition that assumed good faith in return. What they received instead became one of the most consequential betrayals in the history of the world.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the world, the decisions, and the enduring questions of Moctezuma II.
Offered welcome. History rewarded him with 5 centuries of blame for a catastrophe that was not of his making.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.